Welcome to this overview for fault handlers for API Manager, a new feature in API Management 7.6.2. This feature will allow organizations and their governance teams to assign a fault handler policy at the global, API, and API method levels so that it is executed when an error or exception occurs during the runtime API invocation. Let's jump in and configure our fault handler policies. We will start off in Policy Studio. And in Policy Studio by default, we have a default fault handler that is already pre-configured and selectable once the global fault handler is enabled in API Manager. I've also added two additional fault handler policies, one for my PetStore v2 API and then one for PetStore v2 API method. To push these policies to be available for selection in API Manager, you go to Server Settings, API Manager, and Fault Handler Policies. As you can see, I already have three policies here for selection. The default fault handler policy is the pre-configured one that ships out of the box. And then I've added my PetStore v2 API fault handler, and I've added a PetStore v2 API method fault handler. Ensure that you deploy the configuration to the runtime for the changes to take effect. In this case, I've actually already done so, so I'll switch over to API Manager. In API Manager, I have a PetStore v2 virtualized API. Let's just have a quick look at the API. Normally per API, there are few selections for hooks into custom policies that can be configured. By default, you have request policy, you have response policy, and you can do a routing policy as well. If we have global fault handling enabled, we will have another option here that will include a fault handler policy that will be able to select a policy to invoke. So I just want to do a test without the fault handler enabled. So we're going to go back to the API method. So we're going to try this method now. I'm going to put in the incorrect API key, and let's just see what happens with the flow. Okay, so I've just gotten an error back, a 401. A security failure. Let's go into Gateway Manager to have a look at the transaction in Traffic Monitor. It's visible off screen, so I'll just go to the transaction, and there's the 401 security failure. So as can be seen here, the API broker returned the 401 exception. There was no fault handler policies executed at this time. Let's go back into API Manager, and we will now configure a fault handler policy. We simply do so by going to Settings, API Manager Settings, scroll down, and there will be a new section called Fault Handlers. There's a toggle, enable it to switch on fault handlers, and then you will have the drop-down selector to choose the policy that you want to enforce at a global level. As can be seen, the default fault handler policy is there, which is the one that's automatically available. And I've also have the fault handler for the API and a method level API fault handler that I created and customized. I'm going to go ahead and choose the default one. I'll go back to my virtualized API. Let's go to Outbound, and now you can see that there is a fault handler policy section in the Outbound tab of this particular API, and the fault handler policy that will be enforced is the default fault handler. Let's test the method again as before. I will enter an incorrect API key. Okay, we get the same error status code back, 401. Let's go into the Gateway Manager. So we can see now that the 401 has actually been returned by the default fault handler before it was even hitting the broker policy. So now the default fault handler policy intercepted the exception and returned an appropriate response. There's a 401 security failure. Let's go back into API Manager. And we will now go and override the global fault handler policy for this API. I go to outbound, go to the fault handler policy, and now I will select my API fault handler for PetStore v2 and apply the change. I will go to API methods, choose the method I'm currently testing. I will again put in an incorrect API key, and I'm going to try the method again. Okay, so now we can see that I actually got a status 500 back. And the reason for that is I executed a fault handler policy where I'm actually overriding the HTTP status code from a 401 to a 500. I also have a little custom message back, as can be seen here. Let's go and have a look at it quickly in the API Gateway Manager in Traffic Monitor. There is the global fault handler transaction. There is the API fault handler transaction. As you can see, the status codes changed because I was overriding the status code in my custom policy. And here we can see that the PetStore v2 API fault handler was actually invoked in this case. Let's do this a third time by actually applying a fault handler at the method level. We will go back to the virtualized API, go to outbound, and we're going to do a per method override, where you can now see that we have added a fault handler policy to be selected at the method level. So I'm going to select my PetStore v2 API method fault handler. It's now selected. I'll just make sure that the change is applied. And we will go back to API methods and do the same test yet again for the same method that I've added for the override. Again, I'm going to put in an incorrect API key and do the test. Okay, and now we can see I have a 418 error message coming back and a slightly different text description. So let's just summarize what happened. I've configured a global API fault handler in API Manager, which will be overridden if applied with the API fault handler, and which itself will be overridden if I have a per method fault handler policy applied. So it gives you a kind of fine-grained control over fault handlers for your APIs, API methods, and add a global method for the API catalog. I have to note that fault handler policies configured in API Manager are not exported as part of the API collection in the same way that a custom request, routing, or response policies are not exported. The exported API collection only contains references to any configured fault handler policies, so the policies themselves remain in the API Manager configuration. So when you're moving API collections upstream to other environments, for example, test to pre-production or to production, and fault handler policies are configured in Policy Studio, the fault handler policies must be deployed before you import your API collection where these fault handler policy references are located. So thank you for watching. This concludes this video.